All right, excellent. So you've had a good week?
Yeah, yeah. Just again, just we were talking tonight, Mackenzie and and we were like, I don't know how the week's already almost gone. Halfway
Yeah,
through it, it feels like Monday.
it's astounding. Yeah,
Yeah.
but I think I'm still. This is one of the first years I can remember in a long time where daylight savings switch is still impacting me. Weeks later,
Yeah,
or at least that's the excuse I'm sticking with.
yeah. I'm using the same one. I'll right there with you.
So I am showing. All right, here we go. This, it is not the clearest of pictures, but this is one of the two things we're going to be talking about tonight. We're going to be talking about Mexican muralism and abstract expressionism. And I think, do you remember last week we were talking about regionalism?
Yeah.
And Mexican muralism is an additional name given to what essentially is Mexican regionalism. Then the other thing that, and it was, what's her name? The person that suggested the format for this class, she was teaching last year.
Oh my gosh. I know exactly what you're talking about
Okay,
now.
you know what I'm
Just
talking about.
yes,
But
yes. Lauren.
yeah, and she put these two together, and I thought, okay, well, I'm going to go for it. And when I first saw this, I thought this is one of the oddest pairings, because these two movements are separated by their starts are separated by about 20 years, 25 years, and the Mexican muralism is very clearly linked to regionalism that we just covered in the U.S. However, as I was looking into this more, it was fascinating to me because they both seem to be responses to very similar stimulus. Very similar things going on. Regionalism always seems to show up as a response to a really traumatic event for the whole society or the whole culture. Regionalism seems to appear as an expressed need to redefine identity as a community, to find those, to reassert those community or social attachments. And so it almost always manifests as a stylized realism, or a magical realism. And then we look at abstract expressionism, and it emerged right after you would think would be a really defining moment for identity for the society, which was World War II. However, if we look at abstract expressionism, the stresses that people, I think, were responding to were really significant. It came, like I said, 20 years after Mexican muralism, and abstract expressionism shows up in a world where everybody is dealing constantly with this current of the Cold War and the threat of the atomic bomb. And so even though these don't initially seem like they might have a lot to do with each other, I think they are both responses to a very identity impacting societal stress. And it's fascinating to me. It's very interesting to me how different groups of people, and I'm not talking about groups as defined by societies, but by different communities of people who think very similar, they will respond to a very similar kind of stress in very different ways. You look at, for example, the Cubists and the Futurists were both kind of responding to very similar stresses, but they went, even though their art, on a cursory read looks very similar, they responded with very different ways of addressing the situation. And then again, we can look at another parallel would be the Bauhaus and Dada. Both of them are, post World War I. Then the Bauhaus goes all the way towards form and function and an almost OCD level of organization. And Dada looks at those kinds of things and goes entirely 180 degrees away from it. Completely different. And I think it was this class that I mentioned that during times of war, you get both marching songs and love songs. Very different reactions to the same kind of environmental stress or societal stresses. So I think we see something similar going on here. And like I said, we are jumping in time a little bit, but I kind of like doing that every once in a while. It's kind of fun to compare and contrast things that really don't have an awful lot to do with each other. On one part as a cognitive exercise, but also I think it helps us to ask questions and clarifies our seeing in ways that just a normal in situ read would not provide for, I think maybe. But I kind of like those kinds of explorations. So here we have a really excellent example of abstract expressionism from Franz Klein. And here we have an excellent example from Fernando Leal of Mexican muralism. And I like to find the context for what's going on. One thing that did kind of frustrate me as I was putting this together is every once in a while, I don't know if you've had the same problem this week, but every once in a while, Canvas does not like to bring over the thumbnails of YouTube videos. And this has been one of those weeks where it did not like to do that for me. So we just have all the videos have basically just the titles. So, but I found a short video that talks about the Mexican Revolution. And since this directly feeds into the environment that created Mexican muralism, I wanted to talk about it for just a little bit. What is interesting to me is that this also ties into American regionalism very, very closely, because what is going on in Mexico during the beginning stages of the Great Depression, the U.S. government, the federal government, decided that even though people had been born American citizens for 3 generations, everybody whose roots trailed back to the old national boundaries of Mexico from years before, generations before, they were supposed to go back to Mexico now, because the decision was made that there's too much financial stress on the United States. Did you know about that? A lot of Mexicans were told to go back home, and they were home. They were home in the US, but they had to leave New Mexico and Arizona and go to the ancestral home supposedly in Mexico. The real irony of that is that Mexican nationals didn't even have the right to own property in their own land until after the Mexican Revolution. So people are you wake up one morning and find out that even though you've been living here for 120 years, suddenly you have no home in the United States. I think governments make bad decisions because they aren't the individuals aren't thinking as individuals. I think if we realize that as an individual we're the one responsible, I think we have a tendency to make more rational decisions, or at least I would hope so. It seems to make sense.
Yeah,
But
there's a quote, I can't remember who says it. Basically says insanity is rare in individuals, but in groups and societies it's the rule.
yeah, absolutely. Like I came across something that was really fascinating, and it was using FBI software to track serial offenders and it was overlaying that on hunting patterns of great white sharks. And it found out that they overlap. You could use the same software in both directions. You could use the tracking software for sharks to track serial offenders, and you could use a serial offender software to track sharks. And I
Hmm.
thought that's really interesting. But as I was looking at that, I came across a study that where somebody was able to show that behaviors in mobs, uh, it mirrors behaviors in people that are completely insane, but not the individual behaviors of the people that make up the mobs. Which ties in with what you're saying. That's
Yeah.
just really interesting. But go ahead. Sorry, a little bit of a tangent, a little bit of a
Hmm.
sidetrack. But I wanted to share this really short um, synopsis of the Mexican Revolution because I think it really helps us understand the rationale behind the impetus of the Mexican muralist movement, and I think it really helps to solidify it as a regionalist movement.
2 minutes knowledge.
The Mexican Revolution was a complex and multifaceted conflict that lasted from 1910 to 1920. It was a major political, social, and economic upheaval that resulted in the end of Porfirio Diaz's dictatorship, which had lasted for over 30 years, and the establishment of a constitutional republic. The revolution was sparked by a variety of factors, including widespread poverty, social inequality, and political corruption. The revolution was led by a number of key figures, including Francisco Madero, Emiliano Zapata, and Pancho Villa. Madero, a wealthy landowner and political reformer, called for the overthrow of Diaz and the establishment of a democratic government. Zapata, a leader of the peasantry in southern Mexico, advocated for land reform and the redistribution of land to the poor. Villa, a former bandit, led a powerful force of rural fighters in northern Mexico. The revolution was characterized by a series of battles and skirmishes between various factions, and it was marked by a high level of violence and instability. The fighting was particularly fierce in the northern and southern regions of the country, where Zapata and Villa had significant support. The revolution also saw a number of major battles, including the Battle of Ciudad Juarez, the Battle of Torreon, and the Battle of Zacatecas. The revolution was a major turning point in Mexican history, as it led to the end of the Porfiriato dictatorship, the establishment of a constitutional republic, and the implementation of significant political and social reforms. The revolution also had a significant impact on the economy, as it led to the nationalization of key industries and the establishment of state-owned enterprises. However, the revolution also had a number of negative consequences. It caused significant loss of life, destruction of property, and the social and economic reforms were not implemented in the way they were expected. The revolution also led to the rise of authoritarian leaders who suppressed political opposition and civil liberties.
During the Mexican Revolution lasted for over 10 years. And from the official account is that it went from 1910 to 1920, but there are people that talk about it had its roots at about the same time as Cubism, interestingly, in Europe, and it may have gone on until about 1922. But during this time, when Porfirio was the lifelong, forever dictator of Mexico, people that were native Mexicans could not own, or for the most part, could not own land of their own. Almost everybody was a sharecropper, which is miserable. You can see how horrible that as an economic system was for many people in the South of the U.S. And a lot of Europeans had estates, and Porfirio had set things up so it was almost like European feudalism during the after the Carolingian Renaissance in Europe. And there's other parallels too, like literacy was actually lower in Mexico than in medieval Europe, the Dark Ages. It was about 15% in Mexico. I was reading a website where at one point, or during almost the entire Mexican Revolution, on average, there were 50,000 rural students for every 894 teachers. So you have a classroom size of almost 600 kids, if they went to school at all. And I can imagine that a lot of that is that's the age of the average kid that should have been educated, but they most likely did not have access to it. You know, when you have very little infrastructure and absolutely no support for any sort of schooling. During that 10 years, there would be battles where a cycle would be repeated, where somebody would say, hey, let's have elections. So they have elections. The person didn't like the election, so they would ignore it. Or Porfirio was famous for very obviously stuffing the ballot box. You know, some of the anecdotes would be like, you know, 250% of the voters turned out today, kind of thing, where it's just obvious. And you'd have there was even instances where the president and vice president, duly and legally elected, would both be assassinated the same day, and then somebody else would take over. And it would cycle like that. Finally, after 10 years of that, everybody was able to settle down and agree on a constitution. And in this constitution, it returned the rights to vote and own land to the people that were living on the land, which I think which seems obvious to us today, but you know, for the entire 19th century and all of Mexican history, really, this was pretty revolutionary way of thinking, aside from the revolution that had just happened. You know, pretty astounding. And with a 15% literacy rate, nobody having the energy to really pay attention to education, nobody really being even aware of any sort of a national identity, the Mexican government, the constitutional government, decided it would be a brilliant idea to help Mexicans generate the same kind of nationalist awareness that most countries of the modern age have been developing. You know, not to the extremes of, you know, Italy and fascist Europe years later, but at least developing some sort of a pride and identity. And this is where I think it ties into that idea of regionalism. You've come from, this amounts to essentially a 40-year struggle for identity. And then finally the government is saying, hey, let's do something about this. And there are 5 significant artists that really kind of set the standard for this style. And I think as you look at the art, and this, you know, everybody that watches this later too, as we look at the art, look for those indicators that we saw last week in American region, I should say United States regionalism, because Mexico is American as well, you know. And it's, you know, it's, if Canada is American hat, then Mexico is the American foundation. You know, it's just, we're right in between as the US. But as we look at this, you know, there is that kind of stylized, energized realism that was very evident in the United States regionalism. And I think there is that certain element of drama that we saw, like particularly with Aaron Douglas, with the Harlem Renaissance, that I think was just really very powerful. And it shouldn't be surprising, because these are murals. These are not designed to be, these painters were not contracted to create things to be in the Hall of Justice or the National Museum. They were contracted to paint onto the sides of buildings, because these were meant to be didactic displays to teach people about their own history and get them excited about who they were. You know, to teach them about the slavery and brutality of European conquest, to teach them about the horrible things that happened under the Aztec conquest. You know, but also to teach that, to help people develop this kind of national sense of pride that they just survived 40 years of dictatorship and revolution. So I think for me, it's kind of, it's a magical realism that you see emerging that I think you can still feel a lot of resonance with, even with Frida Kahlo's surrealism and a lot of contemporary Mexican art today too. So I think there's a couple other videos that I might want to show that I think would be interesting. And going to keep track of time too, so we don't go over. But this video is a short one about Mexican muralism. And then this one, Los Tres Grandes, are about the three main artists that really established the style and voice of Mexican muralism. And I think I want to watch this first one. This next one, I'll let everybody watch on their own. And then we're going to look at the Tres Grandes, who are Diego Rivera, Jose Clemente Orozco, and David Alfaro Siqueiros. So it's really interesting to see how much of a flavor of surrealism emerges in this. And this is where I get I've seen the phrase magical realism, where it's like that regionalism we saw in the United States, but elevated with a little bit of a fantastical element to it. I'm sorry, I was excited about this and I forgot you guys want to see it too. There we go. And again, for people that are listening later on, if this does not show up in the recording, just go back and watch it again.
In this video, we're going to talk about Mexican muralism. Mexico has had a great tradition of painting on murals, starting during the Olmec civilization on pre-Columbian times, and also after the Spanish conquest during colonial times. But in this video, we are going to focus on one specific movement, artistic and social movement, that took place during the 20th century. A little bit of historical background. Porfirio Diaz was president of Mexico at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. He was greatly criticized because of the great disparity between the rich and the poor, the exploitation of workers, and the fact that he was always favoring European culture and seemed to be ashamed of his own culture and didn't value Mexican culture. And also there were some allegations of electoral corruption that allowed him to stay in office for a long time. This situation led to the Mexican Revolution between the years of 1910 and 1920. The main goal was to overthrow Porfirio Diaz, but also to implement social and economic changes. Our relevant time begins now, at the end of the Mexican Revolution. The first president after the revolution was Álvaro Obregón, and he put José Vasconcelos as the Secretary of Education. José Vasconcelos was an advocate of education through public art, and he commissioned the creation of paintings on government buildings. That is, he paid painters to paint on the walls of government buildings. Mexican muralism is both an artistic and a social movement, and it was commissioned by the government that resulted from the revolution. For that reason, muralism, Mexican muralism.
I want to interject really briefly here. Is, you know, we see a movement like this with muralism, and this seems pretty out of the ordinary for 20th century art. What is interesting, though, is that it is not out of the ordinary as a didactic device to paint murals, educating people in public or government buildings. It is not an odd thing. And we can see this in Turkey and Iran. And then we also see this in Europe. You know, the Sistine Chapel has the magnificent ceiling, but I think it was Giotto who did the same kind of thing on the walls of the cathedral that he was in charge of, building, trying to teach people stories about the Bible so that they could take those stories and learn about them and see themselves in those stories. You know, it was a way of teaching. In Turkey and Iran, there are these old government buildings that 400 years ago, murals were commissioned to educate people about historical events. And this is kind of surprising in the Muslim world, because a lot of us Westerners who are Christian assume that Muslims would not endorse images of human beings on walls. But in Tehran, in one of the government buildings that was built during the Safavid era about 300 years ago, it has several murals. And I'll show you the pictures of that I took when I was there. Several pictures denoting different historical events, like famous treaties and the resolutions of conflict and different things like that. So this is not an out of the way kind of oddity. It is something that we're not familiar with now, except for with the reemergence of street art. But it was a very practical way of educating a populace that had one of the lowest literacy rates in the world at the time. So sorry about all that, but I thought it would be important to point that out. And these are in governmental buildings. This is not uncommissioned street art. This is straight up government contract work, which I think is pretty important too.
Muralism reflects the ideals of the Mexican Revolution. Why paint on walls and not on paintings like in a regular museum? Muralism, paintings on murals, gives access to all social classes to culture and also serves the purpose to educate the people. The main painters of this movement are Diego Rivera, José Clemente Orozco, and David Alfaro Siqueiros. One of the most important themes of this movement was a reflection about Mexican identity. This was the time of crisis in the national identity of Mexico. So it was a time to ask, who are we as Mexicans and what does it mean to be Mexican? And where do we find answers to this question of the national identity? Usually history is a good place to start. So what are the important and key history moments, events, and people in Mexican history? We might begin with pre-Columbian past, the life of indigenous peoples of the Americas until the arrival of Christopher Columbus. Also, Spanish conquest was a key moment in the making of the Mexican identity. Also, Mexican independence from both Spain and France, and Mexican Revolution. Here we can see an example of a painting depicting pre-Columbian life by Diego Rivera called Mercado de Tlatelolco. It's a market, and here we can see people that challenge the idea of indigenous people as savages. On the contrary, here we see civilization and we see peace. Here we have two different paintings that show a different view of pre-Columbian life. Diego Rivera, again showing civilization, peace, work, collaboration. On the other side, we see a painting by David Alfaro Siqueiros that shows an Aztec sacrifice. This doesn't mean that David Alfaro Siqueiros continue with the idea of Aztecs as savages. What happens is that David Alfaro Siqueiros was the most radical of the three muralists, and he always saw or showed the most raw image of everything that he depicted. He was the most critical. Here we see two images of the Spanish conquest, also seeing different perspectives. David Alfaro Siqueiros, again, showing the most raw moments, showing the Spaniards torturing Cuauhtemoc, the last Aztec emperor, while José Clemente Orozco is showing a different image. He's showing Hernán Cortés, the Spanish conqueror, and Malinche, who was an indigenous interpreter. Mexican independence, another important time in history. Here we see two paintings by José Clemente Orozco, one of Benito Juárez, who was the leader of the Mexican independence from France, and another one of Miguel Hidalgo, the leader of the Mexican independence from Spain. And finally, we see two paintings about the Mexican Revolution. One is called La Revolución Mexicana by Diego Rivera. Again, he's showing a non-controversial image in which we can see all the stakeholders of the Mexican Revolution, the main phrases and slogans of this revolution: Tierra, Libertad y Pan, land, liberty, and bread, and a painting by Jose Clemente Orozco in which he's showing another image of the revolution, one that is a little bit more nuanced with some pain and suffering of the people during this conflict.
Okay, we're gonna give it that. There we go. As you were looking at that, one thing that really strikes me is Diego Rivera is the most revered because a lot of his images, I think, feel a lot more approachable. They not quite sanitized. I don't know if that's the right word, but romanticized just a bit and demonstrating civility. And the other two of the three greats, the other two are a little bit more emotional. Like the one is very raw. His stuff sometimes is really hard to see, but they were all three trying to portray a history that is really fraught with pain. A friend of mine who is a Maya scholar, he translated the Popol Vuh. His name is Joseph Anderson, and you can find his translation on Amazon. But one of the things that he pointed out is that from the moment that Columbus came to the Americas, so much atrocity was inflicted by European colonizers that we can trace the destruction and death of about 92% of the indigenous American population from 1492 to the end of the 19th century, directly to them and the things that they did. You know, the slavery, the torture, all that kind of stuff. And I think it's really, which is absolutely terrible. But looking at what these guys were doing with the Mexican muralism transforms a lot of that horrible pain and suffering in a very similar way to what we saw Aaron Douglas doing. You know, with his the Hall of Negroes at the Texan Centennial. He is unabashedly honest about the horrors that his forebears went through and people were still going through. But he elevates it to the point where, without turning these guys into Marvel superheroes, it really does help you to feel a strong sense of pride for your own humanity somehow, which I think is astonishing that artists are able to translate and transport that suffering into something that becomes magnificent. It just really blows me away. As we're looking at these images and stuff, are you seeing any of what I'm seeing with that kind of that stylized realism, the magical realism as well?
Yeah, very much. It's really good storytelling. Like I'm astonished with how much information they're able to convey in a mural.
Yeah, they're beautiful too. But yeah. I can, you know, since this is for basically everybody to encounter, it's not for the people whose idea of a fun time is going to hang out in a boring museum. It's for absolutely everybody to encounter. And I think it's amazing because I think that helped to inform the style that the artists were using. You know, these people, these artists were all formally educated. They were all experts in their craft, and their style demonstrates that they were doing this on purpose. And so I think for the same kind of reason that the United States regionalists were doing what they were doing, these guys are doing the same kind of thing, make it approachable, accessible, and also completely relatable. But also, and as they're doing that, they're also elevating it into a realm of kind of a magical reality that I think is really exciting to see. Sometimes it's happy, like in this one. This is Dream of a Sunday Afternoon in Alameda Central Park. This one kind of makes me excited. But what's also going on is that Diego Rivera is, I think you can see his sense of humor in some of these things. You know, as people in different things that you could claim are just background figures, but each of the individuals in here represents somebody or are a specific portrait of somebody. And there are, just like Hannah Hulk was doing with her Dada collages, some of the people, I mean, some of the depictions would be humorous or derisive presentations of an individual, but in such a way that Diego Rivera could say, "Oh no, I didn't mean that. You know, it's not intended to be rude or nasty." You know, so I think it's really very fascinating, and just the figures I think are really interesting. This, I think, is actually supposed to be Diego because it kind of looks like him. And this is his wife, Frida, right? So that's why I think it's him. And it's funny to me that he's holding the, you know, the hand of a Day of the Dead Sugar Skull skeleton woman, you know, just, which is interesting. And she seems to be holding the arm of Porfirio, which I don't know. There's a lot of really interesting things going on that you can interpret in several different ways. But that's one of the things that make this so exciting, I think. And I love the brilliant colors that are still 100 years later, brilliant, still beautiful. I think part of that is a testament to the quality of craftsmanship, but I think a big part of that is the reverence that this painting has inspired in the people that see it. You know, they take care of it, they honor it, and which seems to me that would symbolize the connection that people have with national pride, you know, national identity and self-identity. Taking care of the artifacts that communicate that, I think, goes a long way. One thing that you'll notice that Diego Rivera seemed to be, out of these three men, seemed to be the happiest. And I think Jose Clemente Orozco seems to be one who's he's a surrealist, but he seems very interested in getting people to think about the painting. And then when we look at David Alfaro Siqueiros, he is very confrontational. He wants people to know that their history hurt, which I think is really interesting. But this is called Gods of the Modern World. And remember, Aaron Douglas's, oh, I'm sorry, let me do this. There we go, that's better. Aaron Douglas was developed 6 panels that were kind of encompassing elements of Black American history. And Jose Clemente Orozco is doing something very similar in this series, but he is engaging the relationship with the contemporary world. And he wants people to establish some sort of believe he wants people to establish a connection with that. And what's interesting to me is we look at this, these figures seem very intimidating. And on one hand, I think that this might be something of a critique of unabashed acceptance of modernity. And when somebody does that, when somebody critiques an acceptance of modernity, it also seems to be something of a support for the old ways or for tradition, honoring tradition. So I think it's kind of an interesting way of dealing with that. But this feels to me, it has elements of that United States regionalism we were looking at, the kind of magical realism, but there also feels to me an awful lot of surrealism. What do you think, Joey?
Yeah, very much. Yeah, this is a pretty wild mural. Yeah, it definitely feels, surrealist, like it's in working to engage with my subconscious.
Yeah, there are things going on that are suggestive of a lot of stuff. We have this honorees of the false priesthood as as a famous LDS scholar referred to academia. But so these guys they represent like modern academic achievement. I think maybe this person is this individual is referencing questions of medical science. That's what it seemed to be suggested with this skeletal form laying down and this person perhaps examining. And I think the thing that kind of supports all that is books being used as a foundation, and then these things that seem to be specimen jars.
Is that a fetal skeleton with a graduation cap being birthed?
Right here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think that this is a criticism of education necessarily. I think that this feels to me more as a warning of concerns. Don't let modernity overtake your identity, perhaps. But it looks like this skeleton is also giving birth to books, lots and lots of books. Too much knowledge can be a bad thing. But this is from the Epic of American Civilization series, and this is called Gods of the Modern World. And we can look at other of his works. There's a lot of these panels. I think there were like 20 of these, something like that. And some of these, I think, feel a little bit more approachable, perhaps not so warning. But this feels to me like some of these are meant to be warnings against betraying your identity and awareness of who you are. So I think that that's really fascinating. Like this one feels like it almost would fit with the futurist kind of, but it doesn't feel like it's a celebration of war. It feels again like it is a warning. So I think that these are really fascinating.
And the context of the different nations that had been basically erased, by conquistadors. And that last one almost felt like they were equating modernity to that same sort of, genocide.
Yeah, I think so. And that and then there's another one here we see that it seems like another version of that called the Prometheanist, which I think is really interesting because that seems to imply, again, the dangers of unabashedly embracing modernity, at the expense of identity. So it feels to me like Diego Rivera was more helping people to establish a positive identity, and Orozco seems to me warning of the dangers when you don't protect your identity. Do you know what I mean? It's a subtle distinction, but it feels to me that that's almost like what's going on. Do you get a similar sense?
Yeah, very much.
And then we look at David Alfaro Siqueiros. He seems to be the most symbolist of all of them. This is a later work from this period. This comes close to the end of the heyday of the Mexican muralism. And what's fascinating to me about this is he really critiques violence and horrible events in a very confrontational way. It's obvious a nasty, horrible thing is happening, and he's not shying away from it. This reminds me more of Bacon's work, like with the Pope Screams, that kind of a painting where it's nightmarish. And I think that this, again, if Orozco is warning of the dangers of not respecting your identity. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot. Here we go. If Orozco is warning of the dangers of not claiming your identity, Siqueiros is telling you that really horrible things can happen, if you don't. And these are the things that we need to be realized are terrible that we can't have here. The title of this is Cain in the United States. And this feels much more to me like it ties in, and this is why I was thinking of Aaron Douglas. It ties in a lot more with, to me, of the lynchings that at this time were still very common in the Southeast US. And I think this feels very much like a warning against misusing your brother. So all three of these painters are very didactic in very different ways. Very teaching in very different ways. And it feels to me like there wasn't a national program where everybody was supposed to paint Rockwell style illustrations. It feels to me like the government was saying we need to help people generate an identity, and we're picking you because we value your voices. And then these artists did what they felt they needed to do, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, interesting that they there wasn't more like censorship, that they have this much free reign.
And some of these feel really, really painfully confrontational. So I think that Siqueiros is supporting people in them dealing with the struggles of identity. It feels to me that Orozco is warning people of the dangers of not maintaining your identity. And it feels to me that Diego Rivera is celebrating the history that comes into identity. So they're all supporting identity, but from rather different perspectives. And I just think that that's fascinating. Now, of course, I am biased. My favorite of the muralists is Frida Kahlo. One of the reasons why I absolutely love her is that, she was a classically trained artist and successful in her own right. But the newspapers of the time when she was alive, during her marriage to Diego Rivera, completely ignored her. And when the galleries in Paris invited her to display, Paris was excited to have Frida Kahlo. Mexican newspapers said Diego's wife is showing some paintings. You guys really missed out. But I love, one of the things that I think is so fascinating about Frida Kahlo is she is really expressing this kind of magical realism, this regional regionalist style that is now very recognizable as being distinctly Mexican. She has a very interesting vocabulary of images that are very surrealist. She's drawing from European mythology and symbols, as well as indigenous mythology and symbols. And this is very directly related to the Greek mythologies about Diana, the huntress. And it's really interesting to me how much Frida Kahlo communicates in something that could be, by somebody who can't be bothered spending any time with it, it could be easily dismissed. But when we start looking at it, it just becomes profound. I'm sure that you can't tell that I think she's really amazing. and I love that. But when I talk about this being another manifestation of regionalism, are you seeing the same indicators that I am that kind of justify that or validate that assertion?
Yeah, I think so. I think again, it's very layered, it's very nuanced work, but it's not hoity-toity. It's way more accessible than like fine artists, I guess. Even the cubists, or I don't know, those sorts of things. It feels like more like folky.
Yeah. And which is a really big indicator of most regionalist art when it shows up around the world. You look at the United States regionalists, they were very folksy, very folky. And which you see this also emerging in during the 70s, there was a movement with a lot of indigenous United States Americans who were doing representational art that felt very regionalist as well. That was several years later. And there was Colorado, I think it was Denver, Colorado, hosted an exhibit with a lot of the contemporary indigenous artists that where those who were realists, it also felt very regionalist. And it's the same kind of thing. It feels very approachable. That's what another thing I love about Frida Kahlo. Yes, she was a surrealist, but you look at Salvador Dali, and he was in a different social strata. It feels like, or he marketed towards a very different social strata. And Frida, almost anybody, kids and adults alike, can really get into her work, which I think is very cool. Yeah, I feel that very much. So we're gonna shift forward. That painting that we just saw from Frida was right after World War II. And of course, what's that?
Oh, sorry. I was gonna say I had the chance to visit her home, Casa Azul.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, in Mexico City, and she, again, it talks a lot about her personal life and just the enormous amount of struggle that she was always going through.
Well, in the video that I have in there, one of the things that people do not realize is that there were a couple of times when she was almost killed. There was a traffic accident when she was a kid, and because of horrible access to really crappy medical care, she was in terrible pain for the rest of her life. The fact that she smiled at all and managed to create anything is a testament to just her undaunted will, and the really supportive people that she surrounded herself with. I just think it's remarkable. I'm sorry, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. I said in her home they have her her bedroom where she did a lot of her work from, and all of her leg braces and all the things are still there. The things that she was actually using. It's pretty incredible woman.
Yeah, just astonishing, I think. And the fact that she was also managed to popularize beauty that was natural and approachable, as opposed to an impossible magazine standard. I think that's a really real strong testament too. That's a difficult struggle in its own right, and she did that. So the other aspect of this module is abstract expressionism. And like we said at the beginning, there's this odd irony of the two ways, or the multiple ways, that artists can respond to very similar cultural stimuli. And I think abstract expressionism is one. The other is kind of an illustrative realism. as well. It's not quite as folky as regionalism was a little bit earlier, but there is this like the Norman Rockwell style illustration that became incredibly popular, mostly for middle class America or the United States. What is fascinating to me is that I think they both come from very similar stimuli again, but we're going to focus on abstract expressionism. World War II started in the mid-30s when Hitler was rising to power, and atrocities were rampant with people that really wanted to forcibly change the world. Some of the stories about what fascist Japan was doing in China, when Japan started connecting with Nazi Germany, they had Nazi ambassadors in China, in Manchuria, where the Japanese had taken over this Chinese community, this Chinese area. The atrocities the fascist Japanese soldiers visited on the native Chinese were so bad that the Nazi ambassador who supported the final solution complained to Hitler about how nasty it was. Think about that for just a second. And so I totally get it, how the people resisting the fascists and the Nazis, I totally get how they were willing to work with absolutely anybody. And I see why Roosevelt and Churchill sided with Stalin. As nasty as Stalin was, and they knew he was nasty, they still did, because that was better than allowing these people to continue what they were doing. But with that, you get a very negative and stressful situation that arises out of World War II, which transformed immediately into the Cold War. And the first evidence of that is East and West Berlin and East and West Germany. You get a very different appearance of ostensibly the same country and the same city, depending on the worldview and perspective of the government involved. It's interesting. This is interesting to me because when I was in Berlin, I met with, now he is one of the kindest people in the world. But when he was a 12-year-old kid, Hitler Youth, a Nazi Boy Scout, basically. And he grew up in East Berlin. One of the reasons why the Eastern government of Berlin and East Germany was not sustainable is that by the mid-'80s, more money was spent by the East German or Soviet government to patrol their own citizens per citizen than people were actually paying taxes per citizen. It was more expensive to keep tabs on their own people than the money that the government was receiving. And the Soviets were heavily reimbursing and sustaining financially Eastern Germany and Eastern Berlin. That kind of conflict was a constant reminder of the disparity of between worldviews, throughout the late 40s, 50s, 60s, all the way up to the early 90s, when the Cold War finally collapsed. Couple that with, what President Truman's decision to drop 2 bombs on Japan. The atom bomb, I'll tell you something, in late 7th century Baghdad, so we're talking about 697, I think it was, a Muslim philosopher who had been thinking about atomic theory. Atomic theory had first been recorded by Greek philosophers. Plato talks about it, where the world was made with That's where the word atom comes from, the smallest particle of matter. And this Muslim philosopher, so this is about 1,300 years ago, said if humans had ever got to the point technologically where we could split the atom, more energy would be released in a moment than all the sun's heat could muster. And I thought, holy cow, how did he know? You know, and I wanted to share a couple things just to provide kind of an environment for this, what was going on. I talk about this a little bit in the module piece, but I have a couple of videos that I wanted to share. And I think that this ties in directly to what we see the Expressionists doing. So there's 3 2-minute videos that I want to watch. I'm pretty sure they're all about 2 minutes. Sorry about that. I love the ads. I think the ads are great. Ads make the world go around. It also makes YouTube free. So.
Humanity went from a global military confrontation to another type of war called a Cold War instead of transitioning to a peacetime economy. Specifically, to a conflict which didn't involve direct military confrontations between the main participants, but rather an extensive arms race, continuous tensions, and occasional proxy wars. Ideologically speaking, it was a battle between Marxism and capitalism. Lasting until the dissolution of the USSR on the 26th of December 1991, the Cold War was long and extremely expensive. Over the entire Cold War period, U.S. military purchases amounted to roughly $17 trillion of today's dollars, and while reliable figures for the USSR are hard to come by, they've most likely spent less in nominal terms, but more as a percentage of their gross national product. In the end, the USSR collapsed under its own weight, as their over-centralized planning just didn't work. Collective farming was such a failure that the once powerful food exporter became a significant food importer. Industrial production and innovation suffered due to rigidity, and Russia went from being the first nation to send a satellite to space in 1957 to being surpassed by Japan and Germany, who had lost World War II. At its high point in 1969, the USSR represented 14.31% of the world's economy, but by the year of its dissolution, it had collapsed all the way down to 3.58%. Comparatively, the U.S. represented 28.69% of the world's economy at its highest point, and never fell under 20%. The end of the Cold War ultimately proved that military might alone is just not enough.
In the Cold War, a lot of things were going on that, you know, we look at today and it's hard to fathom how anybody rationalized what was going on. You know, here in the United States, kids grew up playing baseball and biking around, watching movies, living life like you'd see in the Goonies, you know, Leave It to Beaver, that kind of stuff. While soldiers that were working, defending the Constitution with their lives were going into areas where they were supporting Afghani rebels, being directed by the CIA to destabilize Soviet-held regions by bringing vast amount of drugs into the areas. You know, when the Taliban destroyed that 1,700-year-old Buddha statue, it was with Stinger missiles that the CIA had given them in the 70s. You know, it's mind-boggling. And in 1 year, you would have people confident that they were doing the right thing overseas, and 2 years later, they might be going back to the same area, shooting at the people that they had just helped put in power. Very convoluted, very odd, very weird. And I don't think it's fair to say that the Soviets or the United States, either one, were all bad. I think both of them, it's like what you were saying earlier, governments have a tendency, or can have a tendency, to make horrible decisions that individuals never would have dreamed of. You know, but there's this constant threat. And I wanted to share the other aspect of that threat with the atomic age, which, if you look at hopeful illustrations inspired by people like, the inventor of the geodesic dome, I can't remember his name. He did the Dymaxion People Mover. Brilliant guy. But the things that he inspired were a positive aspect of what atomic energy could do. But at the same time, the United States is citizens are being, and UK citizens as well, are being bombarded by a lot of imagery that really, looking back on it was horrifying. Let's see, I want to get past this ad really quick, and then we will watch. There we go.
I want to be happy. I want to be gay. I want to be normal in every way. But a mushroom cloud hangs over my dreams. It haunts my future and threatens my schemes. Please, 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 where did you go? I've got me a sweetheart, and I love her too. We want to make big plans, but what can we do? When a mushroom cloud has changed every rule, it's keeping our thinking at home and at school. Please, 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 where did you go? We pray, we party, we laugh, and we pray again. And we play it cool and try not to think of the mess that we're in. I cling to my baby, and she clings to me. We talk of the future, but what do we see? There's a mushroom cloud that hangs in the way. Tomorrow looks black, so we live for the day. Please, 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 where did you go? Oh, please, 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 where did you go?
In the late 80s, I had a friend who actually worked on some of these test experiments that were done. And look at some of these trenches that soldiers were in. Let's see if I can find. Okay, this kind of trench. He said that they were conducting experiments with these soldiers a lot closer to where the bomb sites were, and they would dig these trenches that were 20 feet deep, and people had all this eye protection and everything like that. And even with all the eye protection and all the dirt, it was so bright that you weren't able to see for several minutes after the bombs went off. And one of the reasons why the test sites were where they were is because they knew that the weather patterns would carry the atmosphere materials into Utah and up through Idaho and Eastern Washington. There was a lot of Mormons through there, and they knew they'd never complain because Mormons don't complain. Or at least at that time they didn't. And I'm thinking, holy cow, what is the government doing? And you know that these stories are getting out and people are very aware of them. And a big indicator of this was a common public service announcement of the time period. And I wanted to share that. And this was something that was designed to be shown in movie theaters, and where, alongside those old Disney cartoon reels that we'd watch going to movies on Saturday afternoons.
Duck and cover. Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends, because every one of us must remember to do the same thing. That's what this film is all about. Duck and cover. Paul and Patty know this. No matter where they go or what they do, they always try to remember what to do if the atom bomb explodes right then. It's a bomb, duck and cover. Sundays, holidays, vacation time, we must be ready every day, all the time, to do the right thing if the atomic bomb explodes. Duck and cover. That's the first thing to do. Duck and cover. First, you duck. Then, you cover. You duck and cover tight. Duck and cover under the table. It's a bomb. Duck and cover.
He did what we all must learn to do. You and you and you and you. Duck and cover.
Can you imagine that?
They forgot
Really?
the third step is disintegrate.
Yeah. Kiss your butt goodbye.
Yeah.
And it's interesting in this environment. I don't know. I just find that it's hearing stories from my parents and my grandparents who lived through this period. There was this constant undercurrent of fear, and this is where we start seeing the emergence of things like significant increases in chronic pain and chronic illnesses. This is where we start seeing significant impacts of like ulcers. And oddly enough, this is also when the FBI starts tracking serial offenders, particularly serial killers. And just really terrible. And I think the reason why this is important that I'm bringing all this up is that this is the world that created the environment for these abstract expressionists. And I think if we consider the kind of underlying stress and insecurity, where the only reason why the world is going is because of the threat of mutually assured destruction. That both the Soviets and the capitalists know if anybody triggers an initial explosion, everybody in the world is going to die. And that was the only real deterrent, which I think that's horrible. But there's several other short videos I'm hoping that people reference and see, and I'll describe what they are really quick here. We won't look at them. I don't think we have the time because I want to share these other artists with you. These artists, we looked at finding meaning in abstraction, and I think we've already looked at Steve Martin and how to look at abstract art. And then there's a couple really short videos that talk about abstract expressionism, and they talk about what it is appearance-wise, but I think it's also important to know what the environment is that produced the abstract expressionism. And I think if we reflect on that and keep that in mind, it starts to make a little bit more sense, I think, perhaps. Now this, we can see, this is Wassily Kandinsky, and this is his early work, before the Depression. And what's really fascinating is that as you start looking at his stuff post-World War II, it starts returning to this early 1900 type stuff. It starts feeling a little bit more, I don't know if frenetic is, I'm sorry. There we go. This is pre-World War II. And if we can start looking at some of his other stuff where it starts feeling a little bit more disconnectedly energetic, perhaps, might be a good expression. But it's really fascinating to me that he starts off with this kind of abstraction that still feels rather approachable, and then it becomes a little bit more energetic. And of course, Lee Krasner, at the start of her career, the big thing that she was known for was being the wife of Jackson Pollock, which I think is really, like Frida Kahlo, that it just makes me feel sad. But we look at her work, she was an abstract expressionist. This is from right after World War II, so right at the beginning of the Cold War. And we see a lot of energy being expressed in this painting. See if I can get a better. Sorry, I'm not having a lot of success getting a better image of this. But I think this is really rather fascinating. Because yeah, I can see how she and her husband influenced each other quite a bit in their work, but they both took that energy that you see in abstract expressionism and it metastasized it in very different ways, or metabolized in very different ways. I think it's really interesting. So this is a Jackson Pollock drip painting, and I think you'll look at that, and she's using, this is much smaller, but she's using a very similar color palette and some of the same energy. And I just think it's fascinating that her figures, the figures or symbols that Lee Krasner uses feel like they are a bit more controlled than what Jackson Pollock was doing. That's just what it seems like to me. And we're still sharing this. I'm going to mute this, and then we can look at some of her imagery. But she was friends with a lot of the women that were also exploring abstract expressionism that a lot of people didn't necessarily pay attention to. And some of her works were gigantic. I mean, truly huge, just like many of the other artists that were active during abstract expressionism. So some of her things were only, a couple feet on the side. Others were bigger than the walls of most large rooms. And some of her stuff I think is just absolutely amazing. What turns us into abstract expressionism is we can see the abstraction. This particularly is abstracted from, it feels to me like it's abstracted from real world elements. She also did things like that earlier image we saw just a moment ago that feels more non-objective, when perhaps the inspiration almost feels like calligraphic elements as opposed to real world objects. This, I feel, is more abstracted from real world things because it feels to me like there are plant and flower forms. And the fact that it's named Harnessed the Power of the Sun feels to me like that validates that direction. Would you agree?
Yeah, very much. It feels like like a still life somehow.
Yeah. A still life with plants, perhaps fruit even.
Yeah, but then you try to find something like identifiable and it's not there.
No, but it feels like it's just right out of the corner of your eye or right on the tip of your tongue. You just almost reach it. Yeah. And what turns us into the expressionist portion is the level of energy put into it. So, and we'll look at Jackson Pollock, who was also an abstract expressionist, going in a little bit different direction. But it just feels, I don't know exactly how we can label the emotion, but there is a lot of emotion going on, a lot of emotion expressed. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. Then we look at Jackson Pollock work.
Now, of course.
And we can, let's see. Show some of his work on the floor. Jackson Pollock was a student of world art, and a lot of people don't realize how much education he had. Because, my grandpa's response was, a bird could throw up and it would look the same, or anybody can do that. And yeah, probably anybody can drip paint on canvas without a problem. But what is interesting to me is, we learn things like Jackson Pollock really admired and respected the Dene culture, the Navajo culture. He was friends with shaman, and he learned about shooting chant and sand painting, and was absolutely fascinated with the layers of color that were needed for that and the spiritual intensity given to color symbolism. He was also fascinated with traditional Taoist ink blot paintings or ink spatter paintings, where it's in Chinese expression of Taoism, there is a genre of ink art where the ink is directed to be what the ink is, which is a very Taoist kind of perspective. And it's called by Westerners, ink spot, ink blot, or ink drip painting. He's very fascinated with that. And so there is this element of Taoism and spirituality in a lot of his paintings that I think would probably not be as successful if they were any smaller than they are. And the colors of paint were not generated randomly. They were generated and placed on the canvas in such a way that it kind of screws up with your expectations about color use. If somebody asks you which is closer, red or blue, what's the response? Typical person, red or blue is closer. Which one? You look across the valley. What's farther away, red or blue? Blue is typically expresses atmospheric perspective, and so that's what they use to. That's what astronomers use to measure how far and fast stars are moving away from us. It's called the redshift, and there is this thing where we feel that cooler colors are farther away, warmer colors are closer. There's an emotive power with that expression of color as well. And in his paintings, as he's doing this, he messes around with that all the time, where the cool gray should feel farther away, but he places it in front of the warm gray. Or in paintings that have more color in it, the blue is in front of some of the warmer shades, or he'll overlap warmer shades on the blue and move it back and forth all the time. And you can see just in this, he is paying very close attention to the blue and putting that farther back and how the paint is layered. And you're confront this idea of an expression of volume and space without any of the conventional markers that we're used to seeing. And I think it's fascinating. The biggest difference between this and Lee Krasner, I believe, is the fact that the similarity is that they're both incredibly expressive. The difference is I feel that Lee Krasner was abstracted from encounterable objects, and Jackson Pollock was more non-objective abstraction, where there wasn't supposed to be a relationship to the encounterable world. And I think that's really interesting. Two more artists I wanted to look at really quickly is Helen Frankenthaler, very much a contemporary, and her stuff fits soundly within that Cold War and is very expressive as well. And it feels to me that she is more an ally to Lee Krasner, I think, because it feels to me that her work is more abstracted from encounterable objects, objects that we might see in the real world. I have no idea what those objects are, but it feels to me like it's something that if you saw it, you would recognize. Oh yeah, that's what she's riffing on. Do you get that feeling?
Yeah, very much. I can see there's forms there.
Yeah, like right through here on the upper right, it's almost like petals of a flower kind of thing. And this feels to me like it's also akin to a still life. I don't know why, but that's what it feels like. Again, you get these passages of very expressive paint application that is really fascinating. I don't know what emotions she's feeling, but whatever she's feeling, she's very passionate about it. I think that's really fascinating. And then the other one that I really feel drawn to is Franz Klein. His work is really amazing. But he takes it in a very different direction than either Jackson Pollock or Helen and Lee Krasner, takes it in a very different direction. And it feels to me like he's very influenced by graphics and advertising on some level. And the reason why I feel like that is that I feel that he is abstracting letter forms. You look at some of his stuff and it feels very cubist, like this 1948 Chatham Square. But then just a little while later and through the 50s, his forms feel to me like they are abstractions of what you might see on lettering in a billboard or advertising. And then as you move through the 60s, the forms feel to me like they are almost graphical layouts. And I could see that this would morph into color field painting very easily. But it's astounding to me. I see an influence from Cezanne and not necessarily Picasso, but more Duchamp right in here. And I think that that's just really, really interesting. So he is very much an abstract expressionist. His forms feel to be a little bit more controlled. He's a little bit more of a minimalist, but his application of paint feels very emotional as well, very energetic. What's your read on it?
Yeah, I feel the same way. I think all of the abstract expressionist work to me all feels like really frantic. It feels really manic. And his is like much more aggressive, you know, than Helen's was.
Yeah, yeah.
But there's that similar, I don't know, sort of anxiety to it.
And I that is the read that I get from all the abstract expressionists. There is this frenetic anxiety that underlies everything, and they're not extolling the virtues of anxiety at all. But it feels to me like they're almost trying to work it out.
Yeah.
They're trying to express it. Like one of the reasons we have art is to give ourselves and encounter art is to give ourselves permission to feel what we're feeling. And it seems to me that is, you know, considering the time frame and what was going on in the society of the time when the abstract expressionists were doing their thing, that feels very consistent. You know, and I can't prove any of this, of course, but it feels just anecdotally and from what, you know, what we can see contextually, it feels like that's completely an appropriate way to read it. But I do love abstract expression. I find that some of it really nauseates me. I really don't like Francis Bacon's work, and that is completely personal stuff. Some of it is exciting. Basquiat stuff just makes me happy that he's a person. You know, I just love that. But for the most part, I find that it's cathartic. Sometimes you just want to go to the window, open it up, and say, I'm not going to take it anymore. Like what was that? What was that movie?
It's called Falling Down or something.
That was with Douglas, but there was an earlier movie where a national reporter was going slowly insane, and so the producer allowed him to just go on a rant, and he said sometimes you just got to go to the window, rip it open, and yell, "I'm not going to take it anymore." I think that's what abstract expressionism communicates for me.
I took a darker twist than you.
Oh, okay.
Movies.
Yeah, because the Douglas movie I thought is another really good example of that as well. If somebody parallel parks and you have access to it, you know, a bazooka, why not use it? I'm sorry. I should say, as the person conducting the class, that I in absolutely no way, in any way, condone the use of mechanical violence in any application.
Totally saved it. You totally saved it.
Okay, good. But I love the juxtaposition of these two perspectives with the Mexican regionalism that empowered an entire culture and community to give themselves permission to be who they are. And I love that. And then you get the abstract expressionists that made it okay to acknowledge the fact that people are scared to death. And it's all right. You can continue living. And I love those two perspectives. Art can be a teaching tool, it can be a healing tool, and it can be a tool to help reestablish identity. You know, we saw that emerge with the Harlem Renaissance, as well as last week's discussion about the United States regionalists. But we also see that with the Bauhaus. We see that with the Cubists. We see that with the Dadaists. We see that with so many different expressive communities, and I think that that's marvelous. All right, well that's all that I have for today's presentation.
Thank you. Awesome as usual.
I hope you have an absolutely wonderful weekend and week, and I look forward to seeing you next Wednesday. And we have about a month left, and I have been trying to keep up on grading. I was able to do the midterms for everybody, but my goal is by mid next week, this time next week, everybody's grade should be established. I wanted to make sure and do that because a lot of the times when people turn in their citations, they're missing a couple of things. They don't get all the points. And that's the biggest concern that I have. And I want to make sure everybody has a month to fix that, edit their own work, and then return it in so they can get all their points. So I'll make sure and get everything graded by this time next week. All righty?
Appreciate your effort. Thank you.
All right. We'll see you later.